Hey there, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and I'm super excited to share with you the brand new information that we have from EDHREC's most recent SALT scores. We got more than 3 million votes for this year's SALT pollings. So let's quickly cover what's changed, what stayed the same, and dig a little bit deeper into the data to see if there's anything else that we can learn from the SALT mines. Let's go. Real quick, if you're not familiar with it already, the EDHREC SALT scores are a community poll that we like to run to basically see what's going on in players' minds. Here, we're looking at the previous year's results, showing us the cards that the community voted as things that induce some SALT, aka cards they don't like to see during games. Every card is rated on a scale of 0 to 4, where 0 is perfectly chill and 4 is mega flustering. We have a dedicated page for the saltiest cards in the format, but you might also occasionally see a salt shaker icon on some cards on EDHREC too, showing that card's SALT score. The SALT voting is some silly fun, and we especially like it because it can help players identify cards that might warrant a pre-game heads up for the rest of the table. You know, hey y'all, this is my Reanimator deck, it's playing some creatures like Vorinclex that restrict mana, and I don't want anyone to be surprised by that, so does that sound like the kind of experience we'd be in the mood for this game? We've done several EDHREC podcast episodes about the SALT score results in the past, links in the description for those, by the way, but for this video, I'd like to condense and dispense our most important recent findings for you. First, let's talk about some changes. We'll start with the old top 10 most salty cards in the format, shown here with their respective SALT scores. Surprising no one, the cards that can produce the most feel-bads and frustrations are often those that severely restrict players' ability to meaningfully contribute to the game, especially by messing with their resources. When one of these cards hits you out of nowhere, it can really take all of the air out of the room. So these are especially good candidates to mention before a game begins to make sure that everyone's on the same page about the type of experience the table is looking for. Is this a silly game or a sweaty game? We going pedal to the metal, or are we all wanting to lean back and have a chill time? That sort of thing. So that was the old top 10, but now let's look at the new top 10. Well, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Some numbers have shifted, but there are only 3 differences amongst the top 10. Thassa's Oracle jumped from spot number 16 to spot number 7, Yokelhops dropped from spot 7 to spot 8, and Devastation went up from the 14th most salty card to the 10th most salty card. So yeah, there's been a little jostling up and down amongst the top 20 to 25 most salty cards, but things have for the most part stayed the same. However, keen viewers have probably noticed something about these numbers. These numbers are a little bit lower than the previous SALT scores now, aren't they? What's going on there? What's that about? Like, let's take the top card, Stasis, as an example. It's still in the top spot, but now it has a SALT score of 2.92, whereas it previously held a SALT score of 3.11. Winter Orb now has a SALT score of 2.91, but it used to have a SALT score of 3.0. This appears to be true across all the top 10. SALT scores are either 0.1 or in some cases 0.2 less salty than they were previously. Is this a signal of something? Can we take this to mean that players are getting less flustered by these types of cards, for instance? Or is this perhaps a sign that players are growing less salty about cards in the format overall? Well, we did a lot of talking with the folks from Architect and with MTGDS, aka MTG Data Science, both of whom were a tremendous help on this entire project. Links to them and their stuff in the description too, check them out. And we really wanted to critically examine these results to see if there is actually a trend here. So when we compared the average scores from last year against the average scores from this year, we discovered that the average scores have actually in fact dropped by 0.0028. So yeah, not really that significant. The slight shifts in the numbers at the very top of the list are certainly interesting, but that alone with the stuff going on overall is just not significant enough for us to feel comfortable making any claims about a deeper meaning here. As with all of the data on EDHREC, this information is best used in a relative fashion. The exact numbers are not really so important compared to the way that these cards relate to each other within the data. In other words, Swords to Plowshares being in over 400,000 decks is interesting, but on its own, that doesn't tell you anything. You know, how many decks are there total in the database? How many decks do other cards show up in? You need comparison to create meaning there. It's not just about the raw number of decks that Swords to Plowshares shows up in, but it's more informative to note that Swords to Plowshares appears in 58% of the decks that are eligible to play it. Similarly, Expropriate having a SALT score of 2.5 is again interesting, but what does that mean on its own? It's more important for us to zoom out. For example, I find it noteworthy not just that Expropriate has a SALT score of 2.5, but also that there are only about 30 cards that have a SALT score above a 2.0, while the overwhelming majority of Magic cards have scores lower than a 2 out of 4. Those sorts of comparisons are where we can derive meaning and make informed conclusions. Alright, so perhaps that change wasn't the most significant, but that just begs the question, what were the most significant changes in the data? And are there any trends that we can notice about the ways that certain things might have moved up or down in the SALT scores? Well, you're in luck, because it turns out that, yeah, there's definitely some interesting stuff going on here. Let's start off with the biggest increases. Old Gnawbone, the treasure-making dragon, went from a SALT score of 0.5 to a score of 1.14, a total increase of 0.9, nearly jumping up a full point. Prosper Tomebound went from a 0.19 to a score of 0.88. Dress Down began at a 0.11 and is now up to a 0.64, a curious increase of about half a point. And Yuriko, Chatterfang, Leveler, and Ragavan all saw an increase of 0.42, increasing their scores to 1.6, 0.6, 0.97, and 1.37 respectively. And for two final examples, Zorn and Goldspan Dragon each bumped up by approximately 0.4, giving Zorn a score of, well, 0.4, and pushing Goldspan above the 1.0 mark. Those were the biggest upticks in SALT scores, and there's a lot to examine here, but the most immediate trend we notice is definitely the amount of treasure stuff amidst these biggest risers. Old Gnawbone in particular feels emblematic of the confluence of player frustration towards the increasing prevalence of treasure tokens in the format, and simultaneously frustration with Green's color pie, generally feeling like it's a bit too far-reaching compared to the other colors. But Old Gnawbone is not alone here. Zorn, Prosper, Goldspan Dragon, there are several other big treasure cards with notable increases. So we dug deeper, and it turns out these are not the only treasure cards that rose up in the rankings. These were just the biggest risers, but there were several other bumps upward for treasure cards. Dockside Extortionist went from 2.0 to 2.32. Stormkiln Artist went from 0.28 to 0.65. Even Academy Manufactor nearly doubled from 0.37 to 0.72. In fact, we did a mass search on any card that said the words treasure token on it, and which received a bare minimum of at least 50 votes in this year's poll and in last year's poll. On average, those cards saw an increase in SALT score by 0.076. By contrast, the average change for all other cards meeting those same thresholds that did not say treasure token on them saw a change of minus 0.01. Now, these numbers are small, but it's still a trend that we feel very confident in pointing out. Players are certainly affected by the way that treasures dominated design spaces this year. Wizards of the Coast, we hope you're listening, because this information seems pretty important. Actually, I've spoken with designers who agreed that they pushed treasures too much this year, so hopefully that's information that the company already knows about the player base, but I don't know, at the same time, it's just nice to have evidence of the struggle, you know? As for some of the other biggest risers, I find Leveler to be a very funny one. I think it's obvious that the rise in points here is largely owed to this card's relationship with the Beamtown Bullies, where you can hand out the Leveler to an opponent and thus basically delete them from the game. And then there are a lot of interpretations to examine for the other big increasers. For instance, did the increase in ninjas from Neon Dynasty make Yuriko, an already extremely strong commander, even more powerful and thus affect player perception of her? Has Chatterfang's popularity and power made it more flustering to play against, since it appears at first to be a friendly squirrel deck, but in actuality it's capable of being a monster combo engine? Do these SALT scores perhaps represent any waves that these known CEDH commanders have been making recently in competitive circles? Or do these scores simply represent player acknowledgement of how pushed and powerful these cards are in general? The shift in scores for treasure cards was very obvious and apparent, but there are a lot of interpretations to make about these other biggest risers, and I'd love to hear your theories about them in the comments below. And hey, what about the flip side? Which cards went down in the SALT scores? Well, I'll actually start with two smaller standouts before I get to the big stuff. First, Salt Road Quartermasters used to have a SALT score of 0.86, but this year it got a SALT score of 0.18. We appreciate the good fight, y'all, but the meme was just a dream this year. And I guess the random card that happened to have the word salt in the name just couldn't keep the joke going anymore. Next, I also want to highlight the downshift for Xanathar Guild Kingpin, which went down from 1.64 to 0.85. I gotta say, that's a big chunk down. I imagine that since this card was a little bit new the last time we ran the Salt polls, this card initially raised some hackles because the plan of this deck is to steal things from other players, but the reality of playing with and against this deck has probably allowed for some players to cool off about it. This ain't no Sen triplets, you know? Xanathar grabs cards off the top of the deck, which isn't quite as demoralizing as someone emptying your hand. Plus, we just got a whole bunch of Baldur's Gate cards that are all about stealing enemy spells en masse, so I wager that this strategy is becoming less of a mental boogeyman. And it's also entirely possible that this shift is largely a result of the difference between playing this card virtually via programs such as Spelltable versus the effect of playing them in person. However, let's prepare ourselves for the most significant jumps here. The cards that saw the biggest drops down in the Salt scores were these. The Walking Dead cards. Michonne, Negan, and Daryl each dropped by nearly a full point, and Glenn dropped by 0.73. Curiously, farther down the list, Rick Steadfast Leader only dropped by 0.6. Importantly, this now means that Rick and Negan are the only two Walking Dead cards that now have a Salt score above a 1.0. So this is where it's important to remind ourselves that not every Salt score is necessarily a result of the way that these cards affect a game of Commander. For example, some cards might wind up with a high Salt score because they are monetarily very expensive and therefore difficult to acquire. Or they might have a high Salt score because they are famously part of the reserved list, which is a historically touchy subject in the Magic community. Some high Salt score results might have come from something beyond their gameplay function, and this is another such case. So there's a lot to unpack here, but generally we can all see that Magic the Gathering has really embraced the Universes Beyond model and invited tons of other intellectual property into the game, from Warhammer to Stranger Things to Street Fighter, and heck, literally the week that we were working on all this data, they also announced Transformers stuff, and there's Lord of the Rings things coming up in the future as well. Now, the Walking Dead situation happened to be especially messy, and among the first Universe Beyond releases, with a specific set of announcements and policies that have since been walked back. That whole thing was certainly bungled by Wizards of the Coast, but during that time, parts of the Magic community also responded with a truly horrible level of backlash, and the high Salt scores on these cards were lingering evidence of those battle scars, so to speak. And so if you see a Salt score that doesn't make that much sense to you, it's important to remember the human element. And I personally hope that this significant drop that we finally see serves as evidence to indicate that players have finally realized that that whole situation was simply not that big a deal. Alright, let's turn the corner for one more fun data dive. We've seen the top most famous Salty cards and the biggest risers and the biggest drops in Salt scores, but I'd like to examine one more thing. What are the most notable new cards with high Salt scores? Well, here we go. We scoured the data for high Salt cards released within the past year to see any potential standouts. These could be cards to keep an eye on in case their Salt potential is just starting to be discovered, or perhaps they're just cards who had an initial big impact, but players might cool off on them as time goes on. These legends are pretty expensive to cast, so I don't personally view them as a problem per se, but I also get why playing against a Toxrill or a Xander deck could produce some grumpiness against a group that was seeking a more chill or silly time. As I mentioned before, these Salt scores are best used as an indication for which cards to mention in pregame discussions to make sure everyone's on the same page about the gaming experience they want to have. I personally think that the Meat Hook Massacre won't maintain that high of a Salt score whenever we run these polls again in the future, since I bet a chunk of that high score owes to the fact that the card is ludicrously expensive to acquire right now. Oh, and these next 5 round out the top 10 most significant new Salty standouts. Again, we see evidence of some frustration about treasures, what with that Copper Dragon over there. But interestingly, even the new Miram commander earned a Salt score over 1.0. I don't view this as data worth taking action about, and a Salt score of 1 is, relatively speaking, pretty low on the ladder. But it's probably a good idea to keep a lookout on these new cards to see whether their Salt scores are a result of a big first impression that will cool off over time, or whether some of these cards might be primed to wreak a little more havoc in the future. Alright, that does it for now. I hope you've had a great time digging through the Salt mines with us, and keep your eyes open for a future EDHREC podcast episode where we go even further into the nitty-gritty and the behind-the-scenes information about all of this salty new data, and what else we can learn about the format from this information. But until then, remember to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.